Flames licked up the blue hull and turned windows into squares of molten glass. On the open decks, passengers pressed to railings, while crew shouted in Italian and English over the cough of the ship's horn. The Achille Lauro, a veteran liner reshaped into a cruise ship, listed to port under a roof of smoke. Far below, somewhere past the cinema and the dining room with its glass chandeliers, a fire in the engine spaces had escaped every hose. The Indian Ocean took the reflection of it and threw it back, a trembling orange road. Life jackets bloomed like citrus across the rail. The ship's band stopped playing. The power went in a blink. The call to abandon ship sounded just after dawn. You could hear the discipline in the voices. Starboard boats first, families then elderly, move, move. Deck officers fought seized davits with hand cranks while heat pressed through steel. On the promenade, a cruise director who had practiced muster drills until passengers rolled their eyes now counted heads like an accountant. Some boats kissed the sea cleanly and rode clear. Others dipped, caught, and slammed hard as the hull rolled. Smoke drifted low, making every order sound far away. If you knew the ship's past, the scene felt like a circle closing. She had started life not as an Italian cruise ship at all, but as the Dutch ocean liner Willem Ruijs, laid down before the Second World War, completed after it, and sent repeatedly down the long routes to the Indies. Later she went south and east under a new name, Achille Lauro, a flag of fresh paint hiding a middle age of collisions and shipyard fires. And then came a night in 1985 when men with rifles took her in the Mediterranean, and a passenger in a wheelchair, Leon Klinghoffer, never came home. The world learned the ship's name because of that murder. 9 years later, far from the headlines that had made her famous, she was burning on open water. Fire prefers corners the way water prefers low places. On this night, it found a crankcase in the engine room and the oil that lives inside every big ship like blood. A bang, a flash, and a bloom of heat in a space threaded with cable and pipe. Then more fire, leaping through blankets of insulation. The first water only spread it thin. Hoses ran out. Power died. With the ship listing and flames climbing toward passenger decks, the order became inevitable. Lower away. From the boat deck, you could see the trail the liner had cut through black water. A faint rippling line now stopped. The stars were so bright that some people mistook fishing dhows for rescue ships. Crew knocked on doors and sent passengers down ladders slick with spray. In a few places, heat blew from the shell plating and cut off the route to the main lifeboats. Those trapped on the stern climbed down a rope ladder, hand over hand, to rubber inflatables that kissed and bucked in the wake. A woman slipped and fell to the sponson, then into the sea. A man jumped too early and struck a thwart. Most made it. Not all did. The radio brought voices into the dark, merchant skippers giving positions, a frigate captain promising speed, a helicopter crew calculating range. The American warships USS Gettysburg and USS Halliburton drove hard for the position and set up triage stations with coffee and blankets in steel rooms that smelled of paint and machine oil. Merchant ships hauled passengers up Jacob's ladders by the elbows, taking handbags, cameras, one small dog. Watching from those decks, survivors saw their former home tilt farther, the painted name bending toward the waterline. Somewhere inside, a dinner service gave up and shattered. Somewhere else, a sprinkler head hissed a line of clean rain into a heat too fierce to notice. By midday, the next day, the fire had a pulse of its own. It smoldered, flared, went dark, then found new air and ran. Salvage talk began. Could a tug take a line and pull her toward a beach? Could a fireboat cut the heat down to something men could walk past in suits? But the ship had already made up her mind. When the bow rose and settled the wrong way, even the stubborn read the sign. The last crew were taken off. The sea went on being the sea. In the days that followed, the facts hardened into the sort of summary that looks tidy only at a distance. The fire started in the engine room, the alarms were raised, the crew fought it until they couldn't. Nearly 1,000 people went down ropes or into boats and were taken aboard ships that had answered the call. 2 people died. Several were badly hurt in the transfer and evacuation. A container ship's deck became a hospital. A naval mess became a dormitory. Morning light showed a faint line of soot across the Indian Ocean like a signature. The Achille Lauro herself smoldered for 2 nights. On the 3rd evening, after attempts to assess a tow, after one final boom from the bow spaces, she slipped under. That was the last movement of a hull that had been written over too many times. Dutch liner, Italian emigrant ship, cruise ship, hostage stage, survivor of refits and collisions and smaller fires. If you were superstitious, you could say she collected unfinished stories until she broke under the weight of them. If you weren't, you could open an engineer's textbook and trace oil mist, ignition sources, and the way heat climbs up a ladder of compartments when doors are left open 2 minutes too long. Even so, the legend stuck because it made a shape memories can follow. People remember the hijacking first, a wheelchair on a deck, a family's grief transmitted through radios and newspapers. Then, almost an epilogue, they remember the end in a different sea, under a different sky, with no politics at all, just physics and bad luck. The crew who had been mocked for too many drills turned out to be exactly the ones you want on a slanting deck in smoke. The cruise director became the calm center for 1,000 frightened strangers. The officers took chances with davits and lifeboat orders that, in the end, rescued most of the souls aboard. On land, the armchair questions came in like tide. Why was an older ship still working long routes? Why did anyone ever fight an oil fire with water? Why were there gaps between compartments that should have held? The answers are technical, the sort you can stack on a chart. Refit economics, human error, the reality that standard operating procedures often arrive in the middle of chaos, not before it. A better question sits underneath. What does it take to move that many people from a burning city of steel into safety with only a handful of minutes, and the ocean trying to take your shoulder every time you lean out over a fall? There were moments in those small boats when the burned ship seemed to take a breath, and people thought she might steady. Then a new wind would run the smoke sideways, and the reality would return in a rolling physical way. A boy counted the flashes in the water and said each one was a star that fell off the sky. A purser gave a woman his jacket and spent the next night in shirt sleeves on a heaving deck under a floodlight. A sailor with burned hands refused morphine until he'd finished writing down a tally of who had boarded which boat. At dawn, someone sang a hymn in a language most could not recognize, and, for a minute, the ocean went silent, except for the creak of lines against steel. In the end, there was no courtroom drama, no villain to fit in the space left by fear. There was investigation, yes, recommendations, yes, lessons written in the dry type of circulars that travel from flag state to company and then to every bulletin board on every ship. But mostly, there was memory. Passengers who went to sea for sun and table wine came home with stories that began on a deck rimmed by flame and ended with a ladder over blue-black water and a stranger's hand reaching down. If you stand on a quiet pier and look out at night, far ships still draw clean lines of light across the horizon. Their engines are cooler now, their detection systems smarter, their doors better at keeping a bad minute from becoming an hour. And yet the ocean keeps its old rules. Steel burns if you feed it. Smoke eats time. Training takes what's left and tries to make an exit from it. The Achille Lauro is a scatter of metal on the floor of the Indian Ocean now, down beyond the reach of ordinary divers, her name finally stilled. But you can still hear the voices if you put your ear to the long corridor of that night, life jackets on. This way. Hold the rail. One step at a time. There is terror in that sound and also something stubborn and human. In a world that loves neat endings, the ship left one last lesson behind: that survival is not a miracle but a sequence, performed under pressure, one practiced movement after another, until you run out of deck. Thank you for listening to the Sunken Ledger. Subscribe for more true stories from the depths.